Okay, so this is a trial run for the SPSSI conference presentation, and the topic is on how students change through community-based learning. And my name is Rachel Shore. I'm a graduate student at George Mason University. And how this research came about was there's a class that's taught called Community Engagement for Social Change. It's a class that I've TA'd for twice, and I'm going to be teaching in the fall. And what this class is looking at is it's working with undergraduates, and it's exploring how individual, interpersonal, and systems level factors impact social problems. So the class itself is looking at poverty as a case study. And what the class is trying to do is use service learning as one possible way of teaching students more about social justice advocacy and promoting pro-social behaviors. So the class relies on the course readings as well as the class lectures, and also has a 20-hour experiential component in which students are working in the community. They're placed at different volunteer sites, and they have direct contact with different people in the community. And again, because the class is a case study of poverty, it's oftentimes working at homeless shelters or tutoring students that are in low-income neighborhoods or don't have additional resources, and so these are free services for them to utilize. And this research came about. A lot of students, when they came into the class, hadn't really thought about poverty, hadn't thought about systems-level factors, or really considered their own beliefs or how their own attitudes might impact their own their judgments or behaviors. And so we would see a lot of things like students reporting, "I strongly believe that nobody deserves to be blamed because they are poor. They should be blamed when they decide to stay poor and never act to better their current conditions." So we saw a lot of this type of victim blaming, just as people were either talking in class, or this is a quote from one of the early papers that a student was asked to write a reflection paper. And so we wanted to find out more about how attitudes were impacting people's judgments and behaviors, and possibly how we can help facilitate the process of a transformational process to lead towards more social justice advocacy thoughts and behaviors. And then I included this little comic of penguins watching another penguin fly, where the copy reads, "We just haven't been flapping them hard enough." A lot of times with educators, especially with social justice advocacy, or dealing with any type of racism or classism or sexism, it can feel like, if we just work hard enough, we'd be able to make people understand, we'd be able to have connections to other people, and help them kind of move along in their thinking. But realistically, it's not just about working harder. Some people can only do so much. But in the process of helping people potentially make that change for those that are able or are willing, this is the type of research that'll help educators hopefully create an environment in which more change can happen. So we ended up looking at two relatively different bodies of literature in order to devise our research. So we looked at social justice research. This is one of the models that we came across that we're going to be using as a framework for this presentation. And this was from Dunlap and colleagues study that was published in 2007 that was looking at white students' experiences with privilege and socioeconomic disparities. This model was originally designed at least for socioeconomic and white privilege awareness, but this is just a model that we're using to show how people change. And it has a trigger event that leads to some type of disequilibrium, which then leads to resolution, where individuals are accommodating the pieces of information that they learned and thought about and integrating it into their existing framework, or they're assimilating it and basically dismissing any of the kind of thoughts that happened as a result of the trigger event. So in the context of this study, the trigger events are these eye-opening experiences that happen through the service learning. The disequilibrium is the process of transformation that's happening as a result of the eye-opening experience. And the resolution is potentially the social justice attitudes and behaviors. That component is not focused on, though, in this particular research study that we'll be reporting. The second body of literature that we were really looking at was the service learning research. And what we found is that that body of literature was focusing on three different areas of study. The first was the learning environment, so oftentimes the classrooms that their experiences were being analyzed. The second were the individual characteristics of the individuals that either ended up identifying as having pro-social or social justice attitudes and behaviors, or those that were not. And the third is what we're really looking at here, and that's the experiences that lead people to engage in more social justice behaviors or have social justice attitudes. So we're looking at the experiences themselves, and then really looking at this process of transformation. What is happening that leads people to say, you know what, this was an eye-opening experience, something was happening for me, and it impacted me in some way. So when thinking about our research questions, so we knew we wanted to look at somehow helping students make a change in how they were thinking about things as a result of the class. So we wanted to identify first where educators have the most impact. So as educators, we have the most impact around the trigger event because we have control over where students are being placed, since we are partnering with a finite number of organizations, and then we're matching students according to their interest and availability. And then during the process of disequilibrium, because we're going to be discussing the experiences that happened, we're going to be providing course materials for them to reference, and we're also going to be giving them assignments in which they also need to have personal reflection. So the research questions that we decided to focus on for this particular study was, what were the types of experiences that students were identifying as being eye-opening, and how those students were affected by these experiences. So what we did was we were looking at this service learning course, this community engagement class, and we looked at 45 students, so a small sample of the students that had taken the class over 2 semesters. We ended up looking at 45 different students, 45 different essays, mostly female, aged 18 to 24, and a racially and ethnically diverse course. Students were, again, required to do 20 hours of service where they had some type of direct contact with clients, and we explored a number of different social issues, but really looked at poverty primarily as the case study. A lot of the jobs that students were doing at their different placements, and we'll go more into this in a little bit, but things like tutoring or assisting at homeless shelters. What we ended up doing was then we assigned students, an essay in which they had to describe an interaction with a client that had been eye-opening for them in some way. Then we analyzed these essays using consensual qualitative research, or CQR, and we identified a number of domains, 3 of which will be discussed here. We identified students talking about the details of their service learning placements, talking about their experience that was eye-opening for them, and then talking about how those experiences influence them. So again, this was the model of change that we're using as a framework, where there's a trigger event that leads to disequilibrium, that leads to resolution. And what we found was that there's this additional component that was really important, and that's the context. So before there's an eye-opening experience, there's also the context in which these eye-opening experiences take place, descriptions of location and the job responsibilities that students were having when they had those eye-opening experiences. So the 3 most common placement locations were working in a homeless shelter, working in a community center, and working outside of the placement facility. And these were places like working in a library, working going to a client's home or a community garden. And then there were a number of common job responsibilities. Administrative work, this primarily entailed filing, answering phones at the front desk, gatekeeper responsibilities, so letting people in and out of the building or giving them keys to locked cabinets within the facility, and also providing resources for individuals like blankets or food and things like that. Oftentimes, students were also reporting working with children, working with adults, or working with families. Serving meals was another common responsibility, and also having some type of indirect contact with clients. So this might be reading case files and things like that on clients. So these were the types of locations and responsibilities that were most common where students were reporting their eye-opening experiences. So for the triggering event, these eye-opening experiences, students were oftentimes talking about what they learned about clients, or somehow what they were doing. So making a personal connection or struggling with a client, noting positive characteristics about a client. This quote on the right is an example of a student describing learning about a client's difficult life history, where she writes, "A middle school girl was telling me how her 19-year-old sister died giving birth to her baby, and how her 3 brothers died in war. Her parents and her 3 younger siblings came to the United States 7 years ago. Her parents left 3 kids back in Somalia because they couldn't afford to take the other kids with them." So there's a lot of really powerful information that students were being exposed to as a result of being at these placements. And so we also were really interested in looking at their reactions, this process of disequilibrium. And there's 2 general categories that students were reporting their reactions in. Student focus, so when they were comparing themselves to the clients, their similarities, their differences, reflecting on what this means for them, looking at or talking about their emotional reactions, how they were emotionally affected by their eye-opening experience. And then there was these other focused reactions, where they were, a common one was making judgments or assumptions about clients. So the most common were learning about difficult current or past life history, and oftentimes these were things like learning about mental or physical health issues, a client having gotten divorced or not being able to find a job or transportation to get to job interviews, and also making a personal connection with the client. So these were things like clients asking a student about college applications, or a student comforting a child that was crying. And then there were common reactions. So a lot of times students were reflecting on what this interaction with the client meant for them, how they were emotionally affected, and these were a range of different emotions. More negative emotions were reported than positive. Some of the emotions were happiness, feeling appreciative, feeling humbled, sadness, anger, feeling let down, or being confused. And then a lot of times students were also making judgments or assumptions about what the clients were thinking or feeling, or whether what they were doing was something that was good or was bad. So once we had all this information, we wanted to look at whether or not being placed at a certain location somehow impacted the type of eye-opening experiences that students tended to have. And what we found was that 75% of people that were working at shelters were learning about a client's difficult current or past life history and identifying that as their eye-opening experience. 100% of those that were working outside of the placement facility reported their eye-opening experience as making a personal connection with the client. So what we ended up doing was mapping out what were some of the common reactions that educators could expect when students were placed at different locations. So for those that were working at a shelter, 92% of them had some type of administrative responsibility. And 75% of those were learning through those through the work that they were doing at the shelter, through their admin responsibilities. They were learning about clients' difficult current or past life history. And of those, 76% were then making judgments or assumptions about clients. And here's an example of a quote that I'll let you read, and then I'll read aloud, of a judgment or assumption that one of these students had made. So this student read or wrote, "I realized that the client wasn't a delinquent or a troubled kid in the sense that he would never amount to anything." So this student, as a result of their job responsibilities at the shelter where they were learning about a client's difficult life history, were reevaluating an assumption they had previously made and making a new judgment saying that this kid wasn't troubled in the sense that he would never amount to anything. A second example of students that were at a different location that were placed outside of the that were working outside of the placement facility. 80% of those students were working with children, and all of them reported their eye-opening experience as somehow making a personal connection with the client. Their reactions then to making a personal connection with a client, 80% were making judgments about the clients, 60% were reflecting on how their relationship with the clients impacted them, and 60% were changing their behavior to meet the client's needs. So I picked a different quote to reflect the reaction during this disequilibrium process in which students were reflecting on how their relationship with the client impacted them. And I'll give you a moment to read the quote and then read it aloud. So the student writes, "To me, this was an eye-opening moment as I got to make a connection with someone I never thought I would have. I did not realize how I had stereotyped and stigmatized the homeless by never thinking I could indeed have a stimulating conversation with them or relate to them. I failed to see them as regular people who have gone through tremendous difficulties in their lives." And one of the things that was really powerful about mapping out these reactions and how they connected to the eye-opening experiences and in the context in which the eye-opening experiences took place is that this helps educators realize that students are potentially having different types of reactions during this process of disequilibrium when their thoughts are kind of being shaken up a little bit. It's different based on the context, something that they've got control over, of where students are having service learning experiences, because that can vary the types of eye-opening experiences that they have, which will then impact the types of reactions and what they're dealing with when they're trying to make meaning out of everything. So in addition to those results, we wanted to look at a couple of other things. So we wanted to look at whether students were identifying their experiences as being positive or negative, whether the eye-opening experience was a single interaction or multiple interactions, and whether the clients that students were identifying having these eye-opening experiences about were clients that they had regular contact with, or this was simply a one-time interaction. And what we found was that 57% of the eye-opening experiences were negative, 74% were single interactions, and 72% were with individuals that they did not have recurrent contact. So what does this mean? One of the things that we realized was that students need to have enough exposure to clients to learn the specifics of their lives or to make a personal connection. And that these were the things that were really helping to facilitate pretty powerful reactions. We also realized that negative interactions could be more eye-opening or just as eye-opening as positive ones, and that even students that had limited interactions with clients were still being impacted and could still have eye-opening experiences. We also found that cognitive reactions were the most common, although there was often an emotional component, but that although students' thinking was being disrupted in some way, their conclusions varied, so they were kind of landing in different places as a result of the disequilibrium. So just as we had mapped out before, this could potentially help educators guide students' thinking in the classroom by understanding more about what types of reactions and what types of thought processes were going on. Educators would have more of an opportunity to lead classroom discussions tailored to students' needs, or have students reflect on different things based on their placements or based on the types of eye-opening experiences that they were having. So some students were also considering the external causes of poverty, which was aligned with the course aims. And so realizing when students were more likely to do that would help educators, again, tailor the classroom work to the students that were considering these types of things as a result of their service learning component. So one of the things we found was that a lot of students were engaging in personal reflection, which is another aim of the class. A lot of times the personal reflection was happening as a result of a personal connection, but those that were engaging in personal reflection were less likely to consider the external causes of poverty. So those that were looking at external causes of poverty, that was more aligned with making judgments and assumptions about individuals, as opposed to those that were making personal connections with the clients as their eye-opening experience. So again, this could lead to more structured reflection activities in the classroom that could extend students' thinking and help them process what's going on for them as a result of interacting with the population that the class is focused on. So there are some limitations. The class had an assignment in which students were asked to describe the eye-opening experience, and so all the students that we were including were reporting on an eye-opening experience, not organically, but as the result of the class assignment. And also because this is a cross-sectional study, the reactions that we're coding could be more aligned with pre-existing ways of thinking. So for future research, something that we're currently in the process of doing is doing more of a longitudinal study in which we're exploring how students' attitudes and assumptions and behaviors change over time, and also looking a little bit more at what happens after students experience disequilibrium. So what's going on for the process of resolution? Are students incorporating this new information and changing how they think about things, or are they dismissing their eye-opening experience and just going back into previous patterns of thinking? Okay, and that's the presentation.